Hey, welcome back. Now my keen-eyed viewers out there, and I have a lot of them, I'm not excluding you guys that are not well-versed in motorcycles, but if you look real close at this thing, you'll notice it's not a YZ250F. We're actually going in the opposite direction today, and this is something that I may end up regretting. Now I got this bike fairly inexpensively, and well, she just stopped running, and just doing a little bit of research, the parts for this thing are either extremely costly or obsolete. Now there's obviously things we can get. They make aftermarket parts for this, and at this point now I don't really know what's wrong with it, whether it's a bottom end or a top end issue, but they don't sell a crankshaft for it, so it's going to have to be rebuilt. If it's a crank, top end stuff is astronomically expensive. A cylinder, I believe, on this thing is like $900. Of course, this would firmly put this bike in a category of not rebuilding, but I'm pretty good at digging and finding these parts. Before we get ourselves worked up too much into a frenzy, let's go over the bike real quick, check it all out, and then pull this top end apart and see if we can figure out where our problem lies. 1998 Suzuki RM125 two-stroke. Stay tuned. I'd say we're probably going to need a set of fork seals. Radiators don't look too bad. These two bolts here are correct. Man, shocked. Got something wet here. Doesn't smell like fuel. Not sure what that might be. Shifter's loose. It does go through all the gears. I did check that. Chain rollers, no good. It's got an O-ring chain. It feels pretty tight. In fact, the sprockets actually look pretty good too, so that's something we won't have to do. This tire here is in real good condition, so that makes this bike a definite fixer. Rear brakes are going to need to be replaced, and the entire hardware kit is going to need to be replaced. There's no rubber or anything left in there. That's broken, but some bubble gum ought to put that back together. Now this bike definitely has some hours on it. There's a lot of looseness in these parts, so I may end up replacing that rear brake pedal. Kicker's loose. The brakes seem to feel okay in the front, albeit probably adjusted out a little bit more for my liking. Throttle snaps back. I was looking at potentially replacing the plastics on this, but to be honest with you, they're not too bad. Definitely going to need a front tire. It's a street-ridden bike. The kill switch is on the opposite side of the clutch perch. Seems to be more of a trend nowadays for whatever reason. She's not locked. She does rotate. So honestly, best case scenario for this thing would be a crankshaft. I don't really want to have to do a top end if the cylinder is damaged. But it actually feels like it's got a ton of compression. Either that or it's just the crankshaft's too locked up. The owner told me that the steering stem bearings were just replaced, so we don't really have to worry about those. Well, there you are, a quick overview on the bike. But we're going to kick it, see if she starts. that's definitely not going to work. Let's tear it apart. Well, that one almost came out the other side. There we go. I knew we'd run into a wrong bolt sometime. You don't really need to worry about the bolts holding the gas tank in. I believe those are the ones they used in the seat. This here, known in the two-stroke world, is called spooge. And it is the death of most two-stroke engines. Let me explain. Novice two-stroke riders and some that are unaware will see this, or the oil coming out of the back of their silencer, and immediately first thought is what? I'm mixing too much oil with my gas. So inevitably they go ahead and start cutting the ratio back to 40 to 1, 44 to 1, 50 to 1, and you end up smoking a motor. Now the manufacturers have done a lot of research on this to find out what the proper ratio is for these engines. And what we want to have running through these engines is 32 to 1, a good quality 2-cycle oil. The actual reason for this spooge is that your bike is jetted too rich. If you take a close look at this plug, you can see it's very dark. It is certainly not burning at the optimal stoichiometric range and is definitely running rich. Now I don't need to take the radiators off to do this, but I like the philosophy, work smart or not hard, or get the stuff out of my way. Just like tightening, we want to loosen in a cross pattern as well. Wow, this one will not come off. Wow. That one is on there. I'm going to try and use a chisel to break this thing off. If we can't get it off, then we're going to have to cut the nut off and replace the stud. I don't know what happened there, but it certainly wasn't torqued properly. Yeah, man, oh man, this thing's taking a beating at one point in its life. This here is called your power valve. They use these on 2-cycle engines. It basically varies the exhaust port size and tunes the engine at different RPMs to give you maximum power. Now I'll take our cylinder bolts off. I already took the other two off on the other side. Generally, like I said, you want to do them in a cross pattern, but for the video, I'm just showing you taking the bolts off. So do as I say, not as I do. Now looking up on top of here, I'm already seeing little chunks of stuff. Now, unlike a 4-stroke where it basically just uses the top of the piston or the combustion chamber to do all its handiwork, a 2-stroke uses the top and the bottom, and that's the reason why you mix gas and oil. But your air intake charge, if you can see here, comes in through your reed valve, and it goes into the bottom of the piston, the crankcase. And then there's transfer ports inside the cylinder that transfer that mixture up. Now, I'm not going to give you a tutorial on how a 2-stroke engine works. There's plenty of videos out there, and I certainly don't want to confuse myself trying to explain this to you, because it's not terribly complicated, but more complicated than I want to get into right now as far as explanations. But a 2-stroke engine will fire the spark plug every time the piston gets to the top of its travel, unlike a 4-stroke where it's every other time. 4-strokes tend to produce more low-end torque, and 2-strokes generally need to spool up or get higher in the RPM range before they start producing any power. And what they call that is the power band. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there think that that's an actual part, and you can order one from Motion Pro. The power band is not a part. It's just basically just an RPM range where the engine produces the most power. Oh yes, this crankshaft is smoked. Let me see if I can get this piston off. We'll get a better look at the cylinder when we get it over on the bench. And the piston looks pretty good. Should clean up. We'll have to measure all this stuff as we do to make sure the cylinder and the piston are within spec and are going to be able to be reused. But let's get these circlips out, get this piston off, and I'll show you why the crankshaft is bad. We put a rag over the crankcase. We're going to have to split these cases anyway, but if we weren't, we don't want this little circlip to go flying down inside the crankcase. It just makes it a real nightmare to try to dig out, and just not worth the time. Some light scoring on the skirts. Even if we do reuse this top end, I will get a new wrist pin bearing. Alright, let's get down in here and get a close look at this crankshaft. Now this is your connecting rod. Your crankshaft goes through these two bearings on here, and there's a large bearing on the bottom of this connecting rod. A little side-to-side play is fine. There should be no up and down play. And that's basically just telling me that this lower bearing is smoked. So as long as the rest of the crankshaft is in good condition, we can go ahead and put a new connecting rod on it. But at this point, I don't have any options other than getting this engine out, get it on the bench, and let's get it split. This is extremely common from running these things with the improper oil amount mixed in the fuel. Right here, the seal is not installed correctly either, and that's definitely been leaking. Well, let's talk about these crankshaft seals for a second. On your 2-cycle engine, because the air fuel charge is not only on top of the piston but also in the crankcase seals are critical. The crankshaft seals and the seal between the case cannot have any leaks. On this particular side here, you'll suck air in, causing a lean running condition. This side here, you could potentially suck in air or transmission oil, causing an overly oiled situation. So these seals, when they were not installed properly. Most people invest in the incorrect bolt kits for the body. This guy here went all out and bought that kit for the engine as well. The clutch plates don't look terribly bad. Actually, a lot better than I was expecting. Basket has definitely seen better days. Sometimes if you want to keep track of where these go, you can put a diagram on a piece of cardboard and stick all the bolts in so you have an idea where they go. Now, next step is to split these cases. We want to be 100% sure that all of our bolts are out so we don't damage the cases. Since we're going to be pushing on this a little bit, I don't want to damage these threads. I'm just going to put a hard cap on it. If you guys are going to be doing your own bottom ends, this tool and the installer tool are must-haves for the most part. It's fairly inexpensive. You're talking about under $100 for the set. And you take away the risk of damaging the crankshaft, the cases, and all that stuff. Must-have. The idea behind this tool here is that this outer edge bolts to your case. This center rod pushes on your crankshaft, which will essentially push the crankshaft out of the bearing. What a lot of people do is they get in here and start whacking on this with a hammer. Well, there goes your crank. As you'll see, it's starting to open up. What's going to happen here is that this counter shaft of the transmission is going to hang just a little bit. It's pretty common. I would just give that a little bit of taps as we go. there's dowel pins in here. They're hanging up just a little bit. So we're just tapping it and just taking our time and going nice and slow. If you're going to do any prying, don't recommend doing it on any of these surfaces. If you have to do it right back here a little bit. And we'll put a little extra silicone if we have to. Very strange, you have to split the cases to service the water pump in this thing. And here's our seal on the other side of the crankshaft. This one actually doesn't look bad, but again, we replaced both of them. So here we are, crankshaft out. What we need to do is press these apart and put a new rod on it. That don't sound too good. There's also some damage on the inside of the case. This needs to be cleaned up real well. Looks like the crankshaft was rubbing on it. So put a set of new crank seals, crank bearings, and our new connecting rod. Bearings are flat in there. So taking our power valve actuator apart, on the inside was this little piece here, and there's a race in there. There's supposed to be a bearing that sits in, and all the balls are gone out of it. So we need to definitely get that bearing as well. Now let's go ahead and measure our piston and our cylinder, see if these are going to be reusable. The piston, it needs to be measured about 18 millimeters below the bottom of the skirt, or below the bottom of the piston. And our service limit is 53.880. So if we see anything less than that, this piston is not going to be reusable. So we are in spec with our piston. Good, it'll save us a little bit of money there. Now we'll go ahead and measure the cylinder bore. We need to measure this about 20 millimeters down from the deck of the cylinder. And we want to do it perpendicular to the axis of the crankshaft. So your crankshaft axis is like this. We want to measure it perpendicular to that. So bore size for this is 54 millimeters to 54.015. Anything over 54.015 and we need to replace the cylinder. So I decided to measure this in inches because it actually is a little bit more accurate on this caliper. And maximum bore in inches is 2.1266. So we got 2.126. So she's at the top end, but still usable. So the power valve on this thing actually looks pretty clean. So I'm not going to do any disassembly with that. I'll just clean all this stuff real good up. I didn't even measure the ring gap, but to be honest with you, it looks like it's already too big, so I'll throw a ring in this thing anyway. So now, while we're waiting on some parts, let's get into some tech talk. This might be a little long-winded and technical, but I'll try to keep it in layman's terms as much as I can. When we pulled the silencer off, we talked about the spooge, and I mentioned that's due to it being rich. What that basically is unburned fuel and oil. Now we're going to get into some science of this stuff a little bit here, so bear with me. We'll eventually get there where we need to be. All of this stuff works on a scientific principle known as Bernoulli's principle. And if you'd like a little more in-depth definition as to what it is, obviously Google's going to be your best friend. The long and short of it is, as the speed of a fluid increases, its temperature and pressure decreases. In this particular case, we're talking about airflow through a carburetor. And for all intents and purposes for our discussion, air is going to be considered a fluid. So as the air speed increases, the pressure and temperature decreases. Simple. This is how fans work. This is how aircraft work. This is how carburetors work. So one part of this, which is semi-irrelevant to what we're talking about today, although it does have impacts in aircraft, carburetors, and humid situations as far as temperature drop, that's not going to be a concern to us. I'm just going to touch base on it really quick. 90-degree day, it's hot out, you go ahead and throw the fan on you and it feels cool. Well, it's still blowing the same 90-degree air at you, but because the speed of the air is increased, the temperature actually drops a few degrees, makes it feel cooler. And of course, if you're perspiring, that helps to remove some of that moisture and cool you off even quicker. Anybody out there familiar with using a pneumatic die grinder will know exactly what I'm talking about. A few minutes of using it and your hands are absolutely freezing. You would think the friction of the bearings and everything inside would warm it up, but again, this goes back to that principle. So that's going to do it for temperature. We're going to move on to the more relevant parts of this for our applications. So this is a basic diagram of a cross section of a wing or an airfoil of an aircraft. And Bernoulli's principle is how an airplane flies. So basically, as you're forcing this wing through the air via propeller or jet or whatever it might be, just gravity pulling it, there's a relative wind coming straight onto this wing. So what happens is all this wind is rushing past this wing. Now, on the bottom of the wing, the air can just flow freely by, and you have just normal atmospheric pressure. Now, when this wind hits here, it has to hurry up and rush over this to meet the other one. As this speed increases, the pressure decreases. So you have standard atmospheric pressure on the bottom of the wing, a lower pressure on top of the wing's going to want to move up. Now, if you tilt this wing more into the wind, called an angle of attack, and now your wind is coming like this, as the wind strikes the bottom of the wing, it needs to be deflected down, which creates a higher pressure down here. And now this top wind, which is coming in, has to go even faster to go over. So you have much lower pressure, creates more lift. And that's basically the long and short of it. I'm sure you remember sticking your hand out the car window and turning it, and you can feel your hand lift up in the air. Well, it's exactly the same principle. Also, that your hand will actually go back, which is called drag. And the same thing happens with an airplane wing, but you got the engines pushing it forward, so it counteracts the drag. The drag part is irrelevant for what we're talking about with the carburetor, just kind of bringing it up. So in this demonstration, obviously no magic trick here. There's no strings holding the screwdriver up. The screwdriver is basically just being held up by the airflow across the rounded top of it, and the lower pressure that's created in that particular situation is holding the screwdriver up in the air. So let's for a second take a look at our carburetor off of our RM here. And you notice if you look in the back of the carburetor, it's got these rounded edges that go in and a large diameter that goes to a smaller diameter. This is called a venturi. And just like our airplane wing or airfoil, it's got flat on the side and then rounded on the inside. So when the air gets pulled in from the engine, it has to speed up to go through this venturi. It gets smaller on the front side. Now inside of the carburetor, there's a tube, or like a straw, that goes down to your main jet. And this size is adjustable. And when you adjust this bigger, you make the mixture richer. In other words, more fuel comes up. When you make the opening smaller, you make it leaner. Less fuel comes up. Here's a demonstration I did with some water and some straws. So here's our carburetor bowl filled with gasoline. Of course, this is extremely exaggerated, but these straws will act or represent different sizes of jets. Obviously, being a smaller jet, using a larger jet. You see the air and the venturi will rush over this jet and create a vacuum effect, sucking the gas up the straw or the jet, into the venturi of the carburetor, ultimately being atomized and burned by the engine. Much larger jet, much larger fuel flow. What we're really talking about here is air to fuel ratios, AFRs if you will. And to get the proper stoichiometry or chemical reaction, the best bang for your buck burn on standard gasoline naturally aspirated engines at sea level, 14.7 to 1 is going to be your ideal air fuel ratio. And what that means is basically 14.7 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. Now obviously racing applications and under heavy acceleration, that air fuel ratio is going to change, but this is just a generalized ideal ratio for these engines. So now what happens when you go richer? What happens when you go leaner? So richer means more fuel as opposed to air. So in other words, instead of 14.7 parts of air to 1 part of gasoline, you'd be 10 parts of air to 1 part of gasoline, and vice versa. Lean would be less fuel per part of air. So what are the benefits and downfalls of each? The only real benefit to running rich is the air fuel charge will keep the engine cooler running. The downfalls or cons are going to be reduced power, plug fouling. So lean is kind of the opposite. The engine is going to run hotter. You're definitely more prone to having issues with engine damage, including piston meltdowns and stuff like that. But lean does produce more power to a certain point. So now that we've talked about how the carburetor works, how it meters air and fuel properly, let's get into the oil ratio and why that's important. So like I've said a couple of times already, the reason for the spooge and a lot of times excess smoking is that it is rich, not rich on oil. The air fuel ratio is rich. So if you look at these two samples here, obviously one is just a standard non-ethanol gasoline and the other flask or beaker or whatever you want to call it, I've got some standard 2-cycle oil. Now as you can see when I pour them, the gasoline's viscosity is obviously much thinner than the oil. And when you mix these two together, you can liken this to having a glass of milk with a straw in it and adding ice cream, mixing ice cream with it, and the ice cream would be your 2-stroke oil. So what happens is you've got a standard airflow that doesn't change coming into the engine through the venturi of the carburetor, and you've got a standard size jet, whatever it might be, and let's say it's spooging, okay? So first thing people think, well, I got too much oil, I'm going to drop my oil ratio down. Well, what you're doing is actually making your problem worse. So if you take that ice cream analogy or milkshake analogy, with the jetting that you have, if you remove oil, the fuel gets thinner, makes it easier for the airflow to suck it up, in which case now you're even richer than you were before. Now adding oil makes the oil fuel mixture thicker, harder to suck up. You lean it out. So basically here, if you use the same air and the same jet and you reduce the oil, you thin out the mixture, you make the system richer, and now you're still dropping lubrication, which the engine needs. No engine there. So let's say you go this route, you reduce the oil, and then you jet it properly, lean the jetting out a little bit. Now your bike rips. But again, you're in the same situation. You have a lack of lubrication that these parts need. And eventually what's going to happen is you're going to lock your crank up, score the sides of your piston and your cylinder walls. I tried to explain this as best I could. I may have missed something, and if you guys are unsure of anything, throw it down in the comments and I'll answer it for you. But before we move on from this subject, I just want to mention a few more pluses. So you guys working on your cars, okay, you're doing a compression test on the cylinders, okay, and you got a cylinder that's low. First thing you do, go ahead and put some oil in the cylinder, retest your compression. Now your compression's come up. What happened? Well, the oil has sealed around the rings, causing you a temporary raise in compression, right? Same thing happens with the two-stroke oil. When you have the proper amount of two-stroke oil, that oil will help to seal those rings, giving you more compression, more power. And obviously you've got the added benefits of lubricating the crankshaft bearings, the big end bearing, the small end bearing, the sidewalls, and the piston rings. All bonuses. So basically what I'm just saying here is jet your bike properly, use the recommended oil ratio that your manufacturer calls for. Now some of these aftermarket full synthetic oils may be a little bit thinner, and on the bottle it will tell you to run at a higher ratio. Follow the manufacturer's recommendations for the oil, and all's going to be nice. Let's get back to work. Well, I got everything cleaned up, and this is my biggest point of concern right here. Somebody welded this where the kickstart mechanism goes. I don't know what happened. It broke a while back, and this piece broke off. They have the piece, and I think they kind of like glued it on. And you know, normally I would just say, hey, I'll go get this welded, and we'll be back to normal here on this a little bit. But part of the problem I'm having is where the case halves go together. And I'm sure you can see that because that gap is just enormous. So this thing was pushed back. They welded it up, but it's just gapped out too much. And unfortunately, you know, I could probably fill that with a little bit of silicone, but I think I'm going to try and procure a right side crankcase. You know, they're supposed to be replaced together because they're line board and everything from the factory matched set, but I've used one half many times on a bunch of bikes and never really ran into an issue. So I think that's what I'm going to have to do. So in the meantime, we've got a lot more work to do to this bike. So let's get this front end ripped apart, get these forks rebuilt, and get this front tire replaced. All right, so now I've come to the point where it's time to get this engine back together. And let me update you on where we're at with these cases and all that stuff. So if you remember earlier in the video, we had a broken piece on the back of the case. So I ended up getting a left side engine case off of the auction website. And unfortunately, the service manual groups the 96 to 2000 RM125 together, and I guess foolishly I just assumed that the cases would be the same. I ended up getting a 97 case, and if you look closely you can obviously see that they're different, and it's not going to work out for me. I'll just go ahead and resell this case half, which is in fairly good condition. But obviously they changed and moved the water pump inside the cases for 1998, so the 97 not going to work. So at this point I'm running out of time, so just welded and reshaped a piece on the edge here and re-drilled and tapped it. It is still low because of the way they repaired it last time, but it just is what it is. It's going to have to be. So before I go any further on putting these cases together, I want to change out all the seals, including the water pump seal, which is down inside of here. I've already taken the bearing out so I can knock the seal out. Now you may have noticed I've already popped in a new bearing for this inner support for the power valve actuator assembly. We've had our new crank bearings in the freezer. Get them nice and cold. Shrink them down. We're going to heat the case just a little bit. While we're in here, we're going to put our new crank seals as well. Now we got to seal the case halves before we put it together, which is critical on any bike, but even more critical, super critical on a two-stroke, because like we said earlier, your intake port is actually coming in underneath the piston, and this all has to be sealed very well. Now there is a gasket that goes between, but honestly, I like to give it a little bit of a coat of RTV just to fill in any imperfections and not have any issues. Now the trick with this is to not load this thing up so much that it's like disgustingly spilling out inside the engine. The way I do this was a hard rubber roller. I can just put a very, very light coat on the gasket. If you were sealing a 4-stroke case, you could just run this along the case and seal it that way. Before we slide these together, just make sure we have a little bit of oil in where the slides go for the transmission. Your bearings are juiced up. Now we don't want to hammer anywhere around here and damage this crankshaft in any way, shape, or form. We're going to use a puller to pull the crankshaft through this bearing. And the bearing is tight on purpose. It's a press fit. This part here connects to your crankshaft, slides through this tool. The tool is going to rest against your case. As you tighten this nut, it's going to pull this up and pull your crankshaft through your bearing. As we tighten this, you can see the cases are closing up. And as you do this, you'll have to tap to let the counter shaft come through the bearing. Another thing you want to make sure is that your crankshaft is in between these openings. If it's off on the side of the case here, you could certainly bend your new connecting rod or damage your cases. Once this is done, we want to turn our crankshaft to make sure that it's not binding in any way, shape, or form. Also turn your counterbalance shaft. Make sure none of that is binding. If everything's good, get your case bolts back in and torqued to specifications. Now, on Suzuki's, when you put these kickstart mechanisms together, you have to spline them properly. Otherwise, it just will not work. And what we're looking for in this particular model, as you see, there's a little dimple right there. And then our pawl has a little mark right there that faces up the pawl. And those have to spline together. Fighting me. Fighting. Our clutch basket, you want to take this bearing off the bottom, and there's a little notch in this sleeve, and you go line up with the bearing or the gear so that it will slide by. Now this clutch hub nut tightens to 51 foot-pounds, or you can just get the largest air impact you can and just send it. No, don't do that. Now before I drop this pusher shaft in, I gotta put the lever back in on this side. Now, the kit does come with a new gasket. However, because we have this low spot right in here, I'm going to have to put a little bit of silicone. I hate doing it. It's kind of hacky, but unfortunately that's all I can do for this moment. Well, now that I've got the bottom end all together, it's time to address this top end and get this thing ready to be put back together. I cleaned up the old piston and I've got a new ring for it. We need to check the ring end gap in the cylinder. And we're going to prep our cylinder by doing a light hone on the Nicosil to accept the new ring. Now there's a lot of question on whether you can hone Nicosil or not. And the long and short of it is yes. You want to use one of these dingle ball hones, and we're going to do it very lightly just to restore the crosshatch. This will not fix gouges, scratches, out of round, taper, any kind of issues with the cylinder. All we're doing is scuffing up the surface so the cylinder has little grooves to hold the 2-cycle oil as the rings break in. As you can see, this restores the crosshatch pattern without damaging the Nicosil in any way, shape, or form. Our next step is to check our ring gap clearance to make sure it's not too tight. And then we can slap this piston and cylinder back together. Now this is just a formality to see if it's too tight. In the manual, they don't give you a clearance spec as far as how tight it should be. They only give you a service limit. So there's plenty of gap in there, and this ring will be fine in the cylinder. Now this may be difficult to see. There's a small arrow on the head of the piston that is always going to point towards your exhaust side, unless of course the manufacturer does something weird, but they almost always point toward the exhaust side. Now to put our other clip in, we are going to cover the crankcase with a rag. Last thing you want to do is drop this down inside that crankcase. Not fun. Make sure that's sitting down in that groove really well so it doesn't fall out. It will score and damage the cylinder pretty bad. before I install this cylinder head, I just want to give it a quick resurface. Technically, the cylinder head should be replaced due to the gouging in here from apparently a nuclear meltdown at one point. It's just not in the budget. I softened all the edges so we don't have any hot spots for pre-ignition or detonation. I just ran this thing real lightly over some 220 grit sandpaper, and the purpose of that is to take down any high spots so this thing is perfectly flat and level. I'm going to tighten these head bolts to 18 foot-pounds and a cross pattern. Non-ethanol mixed 32-to-1. Well, it definitely sounds pretty good. Got to blow out a lot of that oil that was in there from the rebuild process. She's not wanting to idle right now, so I got to figure out what's going on with that. But pretty good news, she's back up and running again. Well, I'm happy to say the bike looks real nice. She cleaned up good. It's going to make a great bike for somebody. I'm still having an issue with it idling. I played with the jetting, up and down, left, right, and everything is perfect. The bike actually rips, just won't idle. So if you go ahead and look at the forums, what they're going to tell you basically is, hey, they're not meant to idle. They're race bikes. You just want to rip them, hold them wide open. Unfortunately, that doesn't work very well. If you're in a jump and you need to tap your rear brake and the thing stalls midair, that's not a good thing. Coming into a corner and it stalls on you, that's not a good thing. So we need to get that fixed. Problem is, these Suzukis use this weird bypass system like the fuel injected bikes use nowadays on a carburetor. So instead of having an idle screw that adjusts the slide up and down, they have a bypass port from the back of the carburetor in front of the slide, which allows air through, keeping the RPMs up. Like I said, looking on the forums, this seems to be an extremely common problem with this type of carburetor on the RMs. On the side of the carburetor, there's no adjustment
for the slide. What they want you to do is turn the choke knob in or out, and that's what adjusts your idle. It just doesn't.
And I'm just not happy with that. So more than likely what's going to happen here is I'm just going to order a new PWK carburetor that has an adjustment. It's a 36 millimeter, jet it properly, and then this bike will be absolutely perfect. No issues whatsoever. This was a huge project, my first crankshaft rebuild. After giving it some more thought, I went in and spent a little bit more time and did a little bit more fine tuning and got the crankshaft right in where they want it. It's perfect. This bike is super smooth. There's no vibration whatsoever. It's perfect. I did rebuild the rear brake caliper, the front forks, threw a new front tire on it. Steering stem bearings, as you remember, were destroyed. That's going to be in next week's video. This video was very long, so shortened it just a little bit. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support, your comments, your questions, for your likes, your thumbs up. It's really appreciated. It's been a long time coming, but I got a lot of Suzuki's coming up. So if you're interested in that, tune back in. Till next time,